What if the greatest war movies of the 1970s weren't the loudest or the biggest, but the ones that dared to tell the truth? This was a decade when the world was tired of glory and ready for honesty. Directors traded hero speeches for heartbreak, explosions for emotion. Some of these films were ignored, others misunderstood. But decades later, they've aged like buried time capsules, proof that the most powerful battles are often the ones fought in silence. Number 12. Cross of Iron, 1977. War doesn't always look heroic, it looks exhausted, and no movie captured that exhaustion quite like Cross of Iron. Directed by Sam Peckinpah, the man famous for turning action into poetry, this film ripped away every last shred of wartime glamour. Set on the Eastern Front, it follows a German platoon struggling to survive as their own command turns against them. James Coburn stars as Sergeant Steiner, a battle-worn soldier who's long stopped believing in orders or ideals. His real enemy isn't the army across the field, it's the arrogance of his superiors. Peckinpah's trademark slow-motion chaos makes every frame feel like a painting of madness. The explosions aren't thrilling, they're suffocating. The camera lingers not on triumph, but on the faces of men who have forgotten what victory even means. When Cross of Iron released, audiences didn't know what to do with it. Hollywood still preferred clear-cut heroes, not cynical survivors. Critics were divided, but over time, its brutal honesty turned it into a cult masterpiece. Quentin Tarantino later called it one of the best war films ever made. It's messy, defiant, and painfully human. A reminder that sometimes the most realistic portraits of war come from the losing side. Number 11. The Deer Hunter, 1978. Some movies don't just depict war, they haunt you with its echo. The Deer Hunter isn't about battlefields as much as what happens after them. Michael Cimino's sweeping 3-hour epic follows a group of friends from a small Pennsylvania steel town who enlist with naive pride, only to return as broken versions of themselves. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and Meryl Streep deliver performances that feel almost documentary real. The first act spends nearly an hour just showing life before war, a wedding, laughter, hunting trips, dreams of escape. Then everything shifts. The film's structure mirrors trauma itself, disjointed, circular, impossible to make sense of. The iconic Russian roulette sequence became one of cinema's most shocking metaphors for chance and fate. Cimino shot on multiple continents, pushing cast and crew to extremes for authenticity. The film won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, but it was never meant to glorify anything. Instead, it exposed the slow, emotional collapse of a community trying to make sense of what it lost. It's not an easy watch, but that's the point. The Deer Hunter lingers, like an unanswered question, what does coming home really mean when part of you never leaves the battlefield? Number 10. Patton, 1970. Before modern biopics made anti-heroes fashionable, Patton stormed onto screens with the force of a tank and the soul of a tragedy. George C. Scott's commanding performance as General George S. Patton was so magnetic that it practically defined the word larger than life. Yet beneath the medals and speeches, the film paints him as a man addicted to conflict, someone who loved the game of strategy more than the cost it carried. Directed by Franklin J. Schaffner and written by Francis Ford Coppola, Patton was as much psychology as spectacle. Every scene sparkled with contradictions. A man brilliant enough to win wars, yet too volatile to survive peace. The opening monologue, with Patton standing before a giant flag, became an instant legend, a mix of pride, arrogance, and pure theater. What set this 1970 epic apart was its honesty. It didn't pretend that leadership was noble or clean. It showed how obsession with victory can turn genius into madness. Scott famously refused his Oscar, adding another layer to the myth of the man he portrayed. In the end, Patton wasn't just a war film. It was a mirror held up to ambition itself, showing how easily confidence turns into chaos when ego marches ahead of humanity. Number 9. A Bridge Too Far, 1977. How do you turn failure into one of the greatest war movies ever made? You call it A Bridge Too Far. Directed by Richard Attenborough, this sprawling epic told the true story of Operation Market Garden, the Allies' overly ambitious attempt to end World War II early by seizing a chain of bridges across the Netherlands. The plan was bold, the execution disastrous. Featuring one of the most stacked casts in film history, Sean Connery, Anthony Hopkins, Michael Caine, Robert Redford, Gene Hackman, it was like Hollywood's entire roster decided to reenact a strategic blunder. But that's what makes it so fascinating. The movie doesn't glorify heroism. It shows the cold, procedural collapse of a plan too clever for its own good. Attenborough shot on the actual locations, using real aircraft and massive crowds of extras. Every sequence feels grounded, chaotic, and real. There's no Hollywood triumph here, only exhaustion and disbelief, as soldiers realize they've been sent too far for a goal no one can reach. Critics at the time called it overlong and pessimistic. Today, it's praised for exactly those qualities. A Bridge Too Far stands as a masterpiece of realism, a war film about miscommunication, hubris, and the heavy cost of thinking you can outsmart fate. Number 8. Tora, 1970. Before CGI, before digital editing, there was Tora, a film that achieved jaw-dropping scale with nothing but discipline and detail. Directed by both Japanese and American filmmakers, it's a rare, dual-perspective account of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Instead of turning history into spectacle, it turns it into procedure. Every meeting, every signal, every missed warning builds the dread minute by minute. While American directors Richard Fleischer and Kinji Fukasaku split the narrative between nations, the tone remains surprisingly neutral. It's not about villains and heroes. It's about the inevitability of collision. The film shows two sides making perfectly logical decisions that just happen to add up to disaster. The result is part history lesson, part ticking clock thriller. The accuracy is astounding. Actual naval advisors, recreated command rooms, and real aircraft were used to capture the tension of those fateful days. When it premiered, audiences didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't emotional enough for drama, nor flashy enough for action. But decades later, critics call it one of the most balanced and detailed depictions of military history ever put on screen. Tora isn't just about an attack. It's about the slow, human errors that make history explode. Number 7. The Ascent, 1977. If you've ever wondered what courage looks like when everything else has been stripped away, The Ascent will show you. Directed by Larisa Shepitko, this Soviet masterpiece remains one of the most emotionally devastating war films ever made. It tells the story of two resistance fighters captured by enemy forces during World War II, facing the choice between survival and surrendering their conscience. Shot in blinding snow and freezing winds, The Ascent turns nature itself into a character cold, unforgiving, and indifferent. Every frame feels like a photograph of despair. Shepitko, one of the few major female directors in that era, brings an intensity and spiritual depth rarely seen in war cinema. Her direction is raw but poetic, finding beauty even in hopelessness. The performances by Boris Plotnikov and Vladimir Gostyukin are almost unbearably real. You can see their breath, their shaking hands, their fading will. Critics have often called it the Soviet equivalent of Paths of Glory, a meditation on sacrifice, and what remains of humanity when everything else has been taken. Sadly, Shepiko's career ended too soon, but this film alone cemented her place among the greats. The Ascent isn't about winning or losing, it's about the quiet endurance of the human spirit in the darkest cold imaginable. Number 6. Go Tell the Spartans. 1978. Long before flashy blockbusters tried to define the Vietnam era, Go Tell the Spartans got there first and told it quietly, with grit instead of glory. Directed by Ted Post, this film is set in the early years of American involvement, when confusion, bureaucracy, and bad communication ruled more than strategy ever did. Burt Lancaster plays Major Barker, a career officer stuck in a war that hasn't even figured out what it's fighting for. He's stationed in a remote outpost that seems pointless from the start. The mission? Hold ground no one wants, for reasons no one can explain. It's not about winning, it's about waiting and slowly realizing that the war is a machine too big to stop. Unlike later Vietnam films that went big on spectacle, Go Tell the Spartans keeps everything painfully small. The jungle isn't exotic, it's suffocating. The firefights aren't heroic, they're senseless. Lancaster, grizzled and weary, delivers one of his most understated performances, perfectly embodying a soldier who knows he's part of a tragedy in progress. Critics praised its realism, but audiences ignored it, craving flashier films like Apocalypse Now. Today it stands as one of the most hauntingly prophetic works of the decade, a film that saw the futility of the conflict before history did. Go, Tell the Spartans, doesn't shout it, sighs, and sometimes that's louder than any explosion. Number 5, The Battle of Neretva. 1970. If A Bridge Too Far was Hollywood's grand gamble, The Battle of Neretva was Yugoslavia's cinematic declaration of pride. Directed by Veljko Bulajic, this massive production was inspired by a real event from World War II, when resistance fighters launched an impossible defense against overwhelming odds. What makes this 1970 epic legendary isn't just the story, it's the scale. Imagine rebuilding entire towns just to blow them up for real. The government supplied thousands of soldiers as extras. Tanks, bridges, and explosions weren't effects, they were actual military equipment. Even Pablo Picasso designed the poster. The cast included international stars like Yul Brynner and Orson Welles, but the heart of the film is pure Yugoslav resilience. It's about people fighting not for ideology, but for survival and identity. The cinematography is stunning, wide mountainscapes, rushing rivers, faces smeared with mud and determination. When released, it became one of the most expensive non-American war films ever made, and even earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Foreign Language Film. But beyond the accolades, it's remembered as a film that dared to combine documentary realism with sweeping human drama. The Battle of Neretva proved that even a small nation could create an epic that rivaled Hollywood, one built not from fantasy, but from lived history. Number 4, Catch-22, 1970. How do you make sense of war when the rules don't make sense? Catch-22 answered that by refusing to make sense at all. Mike Nichols's adaptation of Joseph Heller's novel turned absurdity into art. Set in World War II, but sounding like every war since, it's a dark comedy that feels like a fever dream trapped in uniform. Alan Arkin stars as Captain Yossarian, a bombardier desperate to go home. The problem? The only way out is to be declared insane, and anyone who wants to escape the war can't be insane by definition. That's the infamous Catch-22. Every conversation spirals into nonsense, every mission into madness. Nichols shoots it like a surreal circus, the sky filled with planes, the ground with red tape. The film looks beautiful, but it feels like chaos. The humor is dry, the horror quiet. At the time, audiences didn't know how to react. Released just after MASH, it was considered too strange, too ironic, but as decades passed, its relevance only grew. Catch-22 captures the frustration of anyone trapped in a system that punishes logic. It's not about explosions, it's about bureaucracy. It's about how reason breaks before bullets ever do. In a decade obsessed with realism, Catch-22 proved that sometimes the most honest war movie is the one that laughs, because crying would take too long. Number 3, Johnny Got His Gun, 1971. Few war films dare to strip everything away, dialogue, movement, even scenery, and still leave you speechless. Johnny Got His Gun, written and directed by Dalton Trumbo, does exactly that. Based on his own novel, it tells the story of a young soldier horribly injured during World War I, left conscious but unable to speak, see, or move. What remains is his mind and his memories. Through flashbacks, dreams, and haunting inner monologues, we see the contrast between the life he lived and the silence he's trapped in. Trumbo, one of Hollywood's blacklisted writers, shot the film like a nightmare-bleak hospital rooms, flickering light, endless uncertainty. Timothy Bottoms gives an extraordinary performance without ever moving a muscle, his terror and confusion conveyed through narration and expression alone. When it premiered, audiences were stunned. This wasn't a war movie, it was a warning label for the idea of war itself. There are no battles, no victories, no flag-waving scenes, just one man realizing the true price of conflict. Critics called it grim, but decades later, it's recognized as a masterpiece of anti-war cinema, often studied for its psychological depth and minimalist storytelling. Johnny Got His Gun is not a film you enjoy, it's one you survive, and once you've seen it, you'll never look at any battlefield scene the same way again. Number 2, Overlord, 1975. Part documentary, part dream, Overlord feels like a ghost wandering through history. Directed by Stuart Cooper, this British film follows a young soldier preparing for D-Day, but it's told through a haunting blend of real wartime footage and fictional narrative. The result is something eerie, lyrical, and utterly unforgettable. The protagonist, played by Brian Sterner, isn't a hero, he's an ordinary recruit whose fate we already know. Cooper stitches his story together with archival film from the Imperial War Museum, creating a seamless bridge between fact and fiction. The effect is chilling. The grainy realism of actual combat dissolves into the poetic inevitability of a dream. When it premiered, Overlord barely made a ripple. Critics admired its craftsmanship, but audiences used to action-packed epics didn't know what to make of its quiet, mournful tone. Yet years later, it was rediscovered and restored by the British Film Institute, hailed as one of the most authentic emotional portrayals of soldiers heading toward history's most famous beach. There are no grand speeches, no final stand, just a sense of destiny closing in. Overlord reminds us that every massive operation was built on the shoulders of countless ordinary men who never made it home. It's a masterpiece that whispers rather than shouts, and somehow that makes it hit even harder. Number 1. The Last Valley, 1971. When people think of war movies, they imagine tanks and trenches. The Last Valley throws that rulebook out the window. Directed by James Clavell, it takes place during the 30 Years' War, a conflict so chaotic that it turned all of Europe into a map of misery. But instead of focusing on the battlefield, it zeroes in on a small mountain village untouched by violence, until soldiers arrive. Michael Caine and Omar Sharif play two men from opposite sides, a mercenary and a scholar, who strike an uneasy truce to protect the valley through winter. What follows isn't just a clash of armies, but of beliefs, morals, and survival instincts. The snowy landscapes feel both serene and suffocating, like peace hanging by a thread. Clavell filmed on location in Austria, turning every frame into a haunting painting of isolation. The dialogue is philosophical, the tone meditative. Critics at the time were confused it wasn't action-heavy, nor clearly about winners and losers, but over time, it's been reappraised as one of the most intelligent war dramas ever made. The Last Valley shows that sometimes the greatest battles happen far from the front lines, in the hearts of people trying to stay human when the world forgets what humanity means. It's quiet, haunting, and unforgettable. The 1970s didn't shout about war, they reflected on it. These films didn't sell heroics, they sold truth. They questioned authority, dignity, and even sanity long before that became fashionable. And decades later, they still echo louder than all the CGI armies combined. Which of these hidden masterpieces deserves more recognition? Drop your pick in the comments, hit that like button if you love forgotten classics, and subscribe for more deep dives into cinema, that time almost left behind.